Thank you. I'm very, very excited to introduce Dr. Kyla Dahlin here. She's an associate professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences. Dr. Dahlin earned her undergraduate degree from Yale in ecology and evolutionary biology, and she then continued on to a master's at the Yale, then termed the Yale School of Forestry. She actually worked in the Bay Area for a while on ecological restoration before then going on to get her PhD in biology at Stanford. And I'm really excited to have her speaking here today. I think her work is incredibly exciting. It bridges a lot of ecological theory with really cutting edge tools in both remote sensing and modeling, and with a particular focus on thinking about ecosystem processes and disturbance dynamics. So today, Kyla will be speaking about seeing the trees for the forest, predicting ecosystem processes from structure, history, and functional traits. Take it away. Thank you.
All right. Hey, I'm on sabbatical, so I haven't had to give a lecture in a while. So it may take me a couple minutes to get all organized, but I think this will work. Thank you all for being here. And thanks, Elsa, for the invitation. And yeah, I'm going to talk today about forests and trees and functional traits. Before I get started, though, I did want to just acknowledge, I know the sort of space of land acknowledgements keeps changing, but if you're interested in plants in landscapes in the real world, then the places that you're interested in probably also have people associated with them. And so, sorry. There we go. And so this is just one, really, I'm obviously a map nerd, I'm in a geography department. This is one representation of all of the different indigenous communities that have existed in and continue to exist in North America. This is from this Canadian resource called Native Land. And if you're interested in doing work anywhere, it's a kind of nice way to go see who has been in the landscape that you're working in the past. This resource is really good for North America and South America, but not as good for the rest of the world yet. They're still building it out. But I really just think it's great to think about how long people have existed in the places that we like to think about. And because I'm going to be talking about a bunch of different geographic locations around the world, I'm not going to go through all of the different indigenous communities that have occupied them, because that would take the whole talk. But know that there's really a rich history, not just of plants, but of people throughout the Americas, and of course, the rest of the world too. And so, like I said, that resource isn't super great yet for the Eastern Hemisphere, but this is another less great but cool resource just of looking at language families that are spoken throughout Africa. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work in East Africa. And again, just reminders that there are lots of people in all of these places, and none of the places that we work exist independent from the people who have occupied them for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. So speaking of people, the problem that I spend most of my time thinking about is, in my opinion, best represented with this figure. Lots of you have probably seen figures like this. This one's a little bit old now, but I like this particular figure just because it does communicate this spread, which is what is important in my opinion. So what we're looking at here, we've got time, sorry, my gyro mouse is weird, time on the x-axis, and then annual land flux of carbon on the y-axis. And so what you can see, so each of these little squiggles is a different Earth system model's projection into the future, now is right around here, of what's going to happen with carbon. And so if it's positive, that means that the land surface is going to take up more carbon as we move forward in time. And if it's negative, that means the land surface is going to start losing carbon. And so what this particular figure shows, again, it's kind of old, outdated now, but it says over the next 80 years, some models, lots of models, predict that the terrestrial land surface will absorb more carbon from the atmosphere, which is a good thing, right? Because we keep putting carbon into the atmosphere. But some predict that it will lose carbon to the atmosphere. And so the kind of big picture takeaway from this figure is that we really don't know where all of the carbon that is going into the atmosphere is going to go. Can people online hear me okay? Okay. And we don't know where all of the carbon is going to go. And it would be nice if we did, because that would help us understand what the world's going to look like in the future. And even though this is outdated, There have been lots of other studies that have shown basically the same thing. Just I think graphically, this one communicates how much variation there is in these predictions that we make. Oops. So why is this so hard? It's hard because ecosystems are complicated, right? Lots of us in this room are ecologists, and so we probably know this. But there's lots of things going on within ecosystems. Unlike the oceans and the atmosphere, which are more heavily dominated by really large scale physical processes, the land surface and ecosystems are really dominated by the individual choices made by plants and animals and microbes that all come together to make ecosystems function. And the part of this that I like is the fact that everything varies in space and time. I like it because it makes it more complicated, but I also like it because it's, what makes the world so interesting. But it makes it even harder to predict, right? The world is not made up of one kind of light greenish tree. It's made up of lots and lots and lots of different types of trees and other plants. And not just corn, right? We grow all sorts of other things. And to make things even more complicated, we are, of course, putting the Earth through a not well-controlled experiment of slowly cranking up the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, not that slowly, and that is leading to a bunch of different outcomes as well that are causing changes in the planet as we are trying to understand how it works. So it's a complicated system. So it's complicated at these sort of global IPCC scales, but it's also complicated at local scales. And so this is just an example of some work that I've been involved in, led by Danica Lombardazzi at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And this is showing how, so here the red lines, this is again time for just a single year. And the red line is the community land model, which is a land surface model trying to approximate all of the different things that happen in the land surface, as compared to the National Ecological Observatory Network's NEON's eddy covariance towers, air quotes, measurements of gross primary production. And so then this is for two sites, for Oak Ridge National Lab and for Great Smoky Mountains. And then down here we have the diurnal ones. I'll talk about these more a little bit later, but up here you can just see, even, so this is like, I don't want to say that this is the best we can do, but it's pretty close to the best we can do as a model, is this red line. And you can see that there's still quite a bit of mismatch between what we see in the blue, which is, again, more or less truth, and what we see in the red. And so if this doesn't work, it's not really that surprising that this has so much uncertainty associated with it, right? If we're not getting our short-term, sorry, that's cut off, our short-term predictions right, then it's hard to imagine that we're going to do better with these global long-term predictions. And so ultimately, that's kind of the goal that I think about when I'm thinking about why I, keep writing grant proposals all the time, is trying to improve predictions of climate change and its impacts. And one thing that I'll kind of come back to is really this interest in doing things that are relevant at societally relevant scale. So it's one thing to think about an Earth system model operating at the planetary scale, but decisions are rarely made at the planetary scale. And so being able to take that information and then turn it into something that's at a, maybe not a, preserved scale, but maybe a state or a country level scale would be nice. And so to do that, we need, spoiler, we need better Earth system models. And I would argue that one of the things we need to make better Earth system models is a better understanding of what I like to call eco-geographical processes. So not just ecological processes, but ecological processes happening in the geographic context that they exist in. And so this is kind of where I spend most of my time. But one thing, if you're a, more of a strict scientist and you're thinking I want to just live in my green box and not worry about the blue box and the orange boxy thing. I just want to do the science part. One thing to remember is that these actually do feed back on themselves. So even if we weren't putting extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it would still be worth thinking about modeling the Earth system and making predictions, because we can make those predictions, we can look at how right or wrong those predictions are, and then actually gain more understanding of how those eco-geographical processes work. So that's the idea. Try to understand stuff, put it into models, see how those models compare to reality, maybe make some predictions, and then try again and again and again. The two areas that I am most interested in geographically are semi-arid savannas and temperate forests. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Oops, again. So if I were good at being a professor, I would have like one interest area and I would just talk about that. And everything I talked about would be like a single figure from a paper, and they would all fit together to tell some story. But I don't have that. And so I'm just going to talk about two of the many things that I'm interested in and have worked on. And they don't fit together, but hopefully at the end, I will talk a little bit about why I think they could potentially fit together in the future. But right now they're going to seem a little bit disconnected. But these are the things that I spend my time thinking about. First, why are semi-arid and savanna type ecosystem processes so hard to predict or even explain? And then second, how important is three-dimensional variation of forest to the terrestrial carbon cycle? And so this first part, we're just going to live in the world of semi-arid and savanna type systems for a while. And I always have this like, who cares bit? We're in California, so you all probably agree that semi-arid and savanna type ecosystems are important, but lots of places people don't. In the land surface modeling community, people tend to care much more about the tropics and the boreal regions because that's where most of the carbon lives. But I'm here to try to convince you that these dry systems do matter too. Again, California, you probably already agree with me, but you never know. And so first of all, lots of people live in dry systems, especially if you include India, which is a semi-arid system, then billions of people live in dry systems, right? If we just mass these out. They're also home to some of the last remaining large charismatic megafauna in the world. And so if you care about, conserving really cool animals, then be worth thinking about. And perhaps more importantly, from the sort of ecosystem processes perspective, there are these couple papers now, a few years or several years old, demonstrating that even though most of the carbon in the terrestrial world lives in the tropics or lives in the boreal regions, interannual variability is still really driven by these dry systems. And that's because they're so weird, because year-to-year variation is much more dramatic. Whereas like, if you think about no offense to tropical people, the tropics basically just sit there being the tropics, right? And the boreal region basically just sits there being the boreal. And then there's these dry, I'm saying that knowing that I'm looking at tropical people right now. But these dry systems, really year-to-year variations can be hugely dramatic, not just in like super blooms and stuff like that, but also in carbon. And so, so we should pay attention to them even if they're not huge carbon sinks. And so when I was a postdoc, which is a long time ago now, I spent a lot of time thinking about this question of whether or not we can accurately model phenology, so seasonal variation, in these semi-arid and savanna type systems globally. So in the community land model, which is the land surface model that's run by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, it does a whole bunch of different things, but one of the things that it does is try to predict phenology, green up and brown down of systems around the world. I spent a little over 2 years as a postdoc there, and the short answer is no, we do not do a good job. I'm not going to go into the details of that. We spent a lot of time trying to make this work a little bit better. It works a little bit better, but it still doesn't work that great. And a large part of that's because of stuff that happens below ground that we just really can't see from space. And so it's really hard to predict. But when I was doing this work, again, spent a long time trying to learning how the community land model works, working with some satellite data I hadn't worked with before. Every time I presented on this, people would say, like, well, of course it doesn't work because you have to know about my system. In my system, this is what happens, and it's super weird. In my system, this is what happens, and that's super weird. And I was like, ugh, finally. And so when I had some startup, when I started my faculty position, I did a meta-analysis and basically said, okay, what do we actually know? I'm tired of people telling me their like anecdotes about their cute little system that does its weird little thing. What do we actually know about how dry system phenology works around the world? And so we gathered up every paper that we could find that used a sort of suite of terms, meta-analysis style. And this is just a map of where those studies took place and then what the paper said caused or was the sort of driving factor in phenology for that system. So most of them said rainfall, but some of them said temperature and stuff like that. But almost none of these, maybe like 4 of these studies actually experimentally manipulated this. They just all say somewhere in the paper like, yes, that our system is driven by rainfall. And so what we did was we took this information and the information that if they published it about green up and brown down dates and put it into our own statistical model using global data sets of temperature and precipitation and some other stuff to see like, okay, well, does that actually track with what we understand to be true? And what we found was that, yes, temperature and precipitation are good predictors of phenology in dry systems, duh. But so is latitude, which was surprising, even in really equatorial places where you would think day length does not change that much. There's still evidence that day length does impact and help drive phenological changes in some plants. So is plant functional type, again, not surprising to ecologists, but not incorporated in how we do land surface modeling. And then so is continent, which is what I was really interested in here, because again, in the land surface modeling context, we don't consider biogeography at all. And so a coast live oak, maybe a coast live oak's a bad example, a eucalyptus tree and a ficus tree are the same thing in a land surface modeling context. And of course, they're not in, for those of us who care about plant physiology. But what was cool about reading all these papers was also that there's just tons of variation. And, you know, some of this is just stuff that we're never going to be able to predict. You know, there's variation within plant functional types, but even within species. There are these cool common garden experiments where they like plant the same species, but collected from all over the place. And then like their phenology is still different. So plants are just really complicated in these systems. Means that explains why they're so hard to predict. And so sort of moving on from there, I really wanted to do a better job of understanding how we could appreciate all of this variability without having to study each individual plant across every landscape and, you know, stare at it for years and years and years to understand its phenological drivers, because that's not really plausible. And so this awesome master's student, Gloria DeSanker, who's in my group, co-advised by me and Andy Finley, who's also at MSU, she took on this project of using these little boxes. These are Landsat scenes across this East African, I keep calling it a megatransect, to look at what we call phenoregions. And so the idea here is, if you're familiar with remote sensing, which maybe some of you are, a lot of times what we do is we take our data and then we run it through some sort of clustering algorithm to then map vegetation types. And here we're doing that, but instead of using a bunch of different spectral bands, which is what we usually do, we're using NDVI through time. And so these are regions that are clustered. They're similar phenologically, not necessarily similar spectrally at any given moment. And so what you can see for this one down here, right on the border of South Africa and Mozambique, is that there are these clusters of these different sort of phenoregions that are phenologically similar. And so then what Gloria did was put this into a predictive model to say, okay, what explains, or does anything explain, these spatial patterns of these different phenoregions that we see? And for this specific one, she showed that geology and just X location, where you were left to right on this map, is what was the best explainer. I mean, she did this for all of these. And so the original hypothesis was that, you know, there would be some latitudinal gradient, like maybe, I don't know, there would be some latitudinal gradient, and there is not. It basically is just like, depending on the site, there's different drivers, but in all of them, we do have this sort of XY location mattering, which is kind of reassuring. And what we have gleaned from this was that, you know, there's no clear latitudinal pattern. It's not like geology matters more near the equator and elevation matters more at the closer to the poles. That would have been nice. But that because we do see these kind of larger scale patterns, that maybe there is this kind of space in between this relatively fine scale analysis, for at least for my world, and the much coarser kind of continental scale analysis that lots of people, or not a lot of people, but that other people do. But through all of this, again, you know, thinking about dry systems, we start thinking about like, well, if we want to understand how these systems work and how we're going to predict what happens with them, what else should we be thinking about? And so a graduate student who worked with me, who's now graduated, Ryan Nagelkirk, showed up saying, I really want to study elephants. And I was like, cool, I really want you to study plants. And so it turns out, as you may know, elephants knock down trees. And so he spent a lot of time thinking about trying to map woody cover across Eastern Africa and understanding how that related to elephant populations, which have changed dramatically over the past several decades. Lots of dry systems are also really prone to fire, as I'm sure you all know, living here. And so thinking about the impact of fire, again, especially in Africa, I'm always amazed by how much fire really impacts these areas on an annual basis. There's also really cool sort of longer term feedbacks with climate processes like El Nino. And like I mentioned at the beginning, there are also people in these landscapes. And so I've been working with another PhD candidate now, Donald Lakanga, who's interested in trying to understand in a specific part of Kenya, like what exactly is going on with people and their relationship with these landscapes as they change, both because of climate change and also because of anthropogenic pressures. And so where this is all kind of headed now, I don't know. But I like to think about it. And so Ryan graduated in 2021, but he had a NSF award that was supposed to send him to East Africa. Of course, it was delayed thanks to COVID, but we finally got to go this past May to Murchison Falls National Park in Uganda and set up some plots. It's a really cool, really interesting area. We got to go there thanks to Bob Montgomery and Tutula Madumba, who are both have MSU affiliations, which is why we got to work with them. But we got to go measure some trees. And one of the things that I'm doing now is trying to both write up this data and also use it to start thinking about some of the newer satellite data that's going to be available and how it relates to these really interesting savanna systems. So to sort of wrap up this seasonal phenology dryland system part of the talk before I move into talking about forests. You know, I would say that one of the things about this phenology that's worth remembering, especially for people who work, you know, most of the sort of phenology studying community in the ecology world focuses on temperate forest phenology. And there's, you know, people really want to be able to nail it down to the day that plants are going to leaf out and they're going to start, you know, turning from orange to yellow and whatever. And that's great. But in these systems, we're like, if we can get within a couple of months, we would be doing a lot better than we currently are. And so trying to understand these systems and their phenology really does matter to global estimates of carbon uptake. And so we should be working harder to try to understand what they're doing. We showed, you know, that these phenoregions, though, I don't think that this means we need 1 meter airborne data over all of every dry part of the world. And I think there's a lot of space in between this kind of Landsat scale stuff and some of the more MODIS and coarser scale stuff that's been done before to really just think smarter about how to use the data that we have to better analyze these systems, to understand these processes, again, without having to just sit under every tree and take every picture. But again, these systems are like, I like working in dry systems because they're so complicated, but because they're so complicated, they're really hard to work in. And so really thinking about all of these different processes is necessary if we want to get a handle on how these systems work and then start thinking about how we're going to make predictions into the future. For that reason, because these systems are so complicated, I've probably had a lot more success doing the second part of the talk that I'm going to talk about, which is looking at lovely, calm, easy to access, easy to study, more frequently studied terrestrial temperate forests. And so we're going to kind of switch gears and I'm going to talk about three-dimensional variation of forests in the terrestrial carbon cycle, specifically temperate forests. And so here, so I like to think about this question as kind of being divided up into thinking about structure and thinking about function. And there's a very obvious reason for that, which I'll get to in a minute. But you can think about just by itself, like never mind the fact that trees are different species and physiologically and stuff, like just the fact that trees have different structure, does that matter to how they work? And the answer is it does. Structure is really important. These are some studies from Brady Hardiman and Chris Goff's groups showing that these are studies where, so rugosity is just a measure of sort of canopy roughness or canopy complexity. and not thinking about anything about these forests. Each of these dots is a pretty different forest, especially in this one. There's still a pretty strong relationship between net primary productivity and these forest structural measurements, totally ignoring anything else about how the forest works, the physiology, the different leaves, drought, whatever. Just looking at canopy structure tells you a pretty significant fraction of what you need to know about how net primary productivity works. So these guys are all like super on team structure. But at the same time, we know that vertical function matters as well. There's this, I always put this slide in honor of one of my PhD advisors who would just be happy to know that this is here. But we know since the 1950s, there's these really cool studies on, like, I think this is a sunflower looking at vertical differences in a bunch of different leaf qualities that just, you can go read the paper. It's from the 1950s. It's fantastic. But we also know this just from looking at plants. So these are leaves we collected from the same oak tree in Alabama. And this one's from the top of the canopy. This one's from the bottom of the canopy. And you can see that they are different. I mean, if you could touch them, right, this one on the left is like really thick, and this one is almost paper thin. And so again, plants care about their sort of physiological function in their leaves throughout their canopy. So we have this like situation where we know this is what we want to be able to understand, right? These are our forests. This is what we would like to be able to talk about. The way most land surface models think about forests is something like this. Basically, you have, this is called a big leaf model. This one has 2 leaves, so it's slightly more complicated, but most land surface models kind of assume that there's one big sunlit leaf across your entire landscape, and then one big shaded leaf across the entire landscape. And those have some physiological parameters, but they don't vary at all, other than, again, maybe a sunlit and a shaded one, and then there's some soil down here. We know, obviously, that this is not how forests work. And so there's been a lot of work trying to develop sort of hybrid models between this type of model and a model that's really trying to simulate every stem. We call these demographic models, or I like to call them lollipop models, because they're really trying to track individual trees with a bunch of math. And they're nice because they map onto how we kind of understand forests to work in a lot of ways. However, my group and some other groups have been interested in this sort of alternative path, which is thinking about the world in terms of voxels. So voxel is just a portmanteau for volumetric pixel, so it just means a cube. And so the idea is, what if we could build, instead of trying to like stay within our lollipop forest paradigm, what if we thought of our forest as just a bunch of cubes of leaf material in space? There are pluses and minuses to this. The pluses, which is why I think this is a reasonable idea, is because this maps much better onto how remotely sensed data works. The minus being you lose kind of any information about the stems of your trees, which is, of course, pretty important to how trees work. So it's a trade-off, but this kind of cuts out this middleman of trying to take remotely sensed data and turn it into a more lollipop-shaped map, which has its own uncertainties as well. So this is where my group has been living for the past several years now. And so what we've been doing is trying to use data from the National Ecological Observatory Network, the LiDAR data, and hyperspectral reflectance from the Airborne observation platform to build these 3D models of trees. And I'm not going to kind of belabor how this all works, except to say, what we do is we get the point cloud data from NEON. We go out in the field and we collect hemispherical photos to estimate leaf area index. And then we can turn that into these estimates of voxelized predicted leaf area density. So for each cube of forest, we can say, this is how much we think, how much leaf material we think is in each cube. And then from the hyperspectral data, we take samples from the field from the top of the canopy, and then we can make these top of canopy estimates of leaf canopy nitrogen and leaf mass per area. And then what we did was we also collected leaves through the canopy, so then we can estimate not just the top of canopy leaf nitrogen and leaf mass per area, but then how it changes as you go down through the canopy as well, to build these 3D models where for each cube, we know how much nitrogen is in this cube, how much leaf material is in the cube, and then how thick those leaves are as well. So that we just spent, maybe 5 years trying to make this work. If you're not an ecosystem person and you're like, wait, you just said nitrogen for the first time in this talk, we've been talking about carbon and other stuff. Just a quick reminder that the reason we care about leaf nitrogen is because leaf nitrogen concentration is correlated with photosynthetic rate. So theoretically, if we know how much nitrogen is in the leaves, we can make a sort of coarse estimate of how much carbon those leaves would take up given other environmental conditions. So that's why we just started talking about nitrogen. So we did this for a bunch of neon sites and then one kind of bonus site. And just to show some fun field pictures, this is what this looks like. We have a potato cannon, we shoot up into the canopy and we rip leaves off the tops of the trees. We then analyze those leaves in the lab and we send them off to get some measurements done and then connect that back to the hyperspectral data. And it's fun. So Aaron Kamaski led a lot of this work. He was the second PhD student who worked with me, and now he's totally kicking butt working for the Forest Service. And so this is one of the products from his work, and this is sort of an intermediate product to the ultimate stuff we were hoping to find, but this is interesting in and to itself. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about this one because it was surprising and also, I think, pretty cool. So this is a kind of snippet of Talladega National Forest, which is in Alabama, which is where one of the sites that we visited. And this is a map of top of canopy leaf nitrogen. And so this, just if you're wondering, this star is the location of the neon eddy covariance tower, and this is just its flux footprint is that purple. But the reason you see this dendritic structure here is because this is this really hilly environment. And so what you're looking at is all these areas with high leaf nitrogen concentrations are oak dominated forests. They have some other species, but this is a highly oak diverse place. It's actually, I think, one of the places in North America that has like the most oak species. And then these blue areas are areas that are dominated by longleaf pines. They're sort of the ridges, drier areas. It's all pretty sandy soils. And so if you are a leaf physiology person and you've had this figure drilled into your brain like I have, then you look at this and you're like, oh, that tracks pretty well. So we've got these higher nitrogen broadleaf forests in these sort of wetter areas, and then we have these low nitrogen needle-leaf forests in these drier areas. Cool, check, oops, check it all, that all checks out nicely. But when we take those top of canopy leaf nitrogen measurements and we connect them to our leaf area density estimates that we can get from the LiDAR data, and then we sum that up. So here, instead of looking at top of canopy leaf nitrogen fraction or percentage, we're looking at total grams of nitrogen in the leaf material per square meter of ground. So this is like we took all of the leaves. If you were doing this in the field, like we went out, defoliated all of the trees, ground them all up and measured how much nitrogen was in each pixel. You would never do, but we can do with remote sensing to some degree. And what you see is that all of that cool landscape pattern kind of goes away. There's still some patterns, but there's nothing like obviously driving the system. And Aaron did a bunch of statistics to show that, in fact, you know, this makes sense. We can tell a nice kind of landscape ecology story about this. We really can't here. This is just kind of noise. And the reason for that, not the reason for the noise, but the reason that it looks flat is basically because the leaves in the there's a white oak, the oaks and the longleaf pines, when you add all of the nitrogen that we're looking at up in their leaves, it ends up being about the same in total. It's just allocated really differently. So white oaks have more, you know, their leaf material is more evenly distributed throughout the canopy. The longleaf pines are really kind of bunched up at the top. And so while like an individual needle might be really different from an individual leaf, when you look at the entire canopy as a whole, some of that difference seems to go away, which is exciting and again was not really what we were expecting. But then we thought about it more, and lucky for us, other people were also sort of thinking about similar stuff. And this paper came out showing what we knew to be true, but was like helpful to see somebody else like say that is true, is that there are basically no end-fixing trees, at least, in this landscape. There's no reason to think that there would be lots of like spatial heterogeneity in the amount of available nitrogen in this landscape. So even though there are pines and there are oaks, and so they have different, they make different choices about where they put their nitrogen. There's not really a reason to think that there would be like pockets of the landscape that have tons more available nitrogen than others. And Aaron also dug around in the literature and finally found one place where somebody actually did, I guess they would have done it in the 70s and then published in the early 80s, numbers from total overstory foliage nitrogen. Somebody actually did defoliate some trees and see how much nitrogen was in the leaves. And so that's what's shown in these two left-hand ones. Needle-leaf is on the left, broadleaf is on the right, and then these are our estimates from Talladega. And you can see, again, they're not that different. So even though we know that there's this like dramatic difference in these leaf level traits, when we start thinking about the whole canopy, maybe they're not as dramatically different. And so this is actually reassuring and actually suggests that maybe, we don't need to know every individual plant species in order to predict how they're going to interact with the environment and take up carbon, because plants, as we know, are kind of optimizing for their environment. This is only one tiny corner of that like big question, and so certainly there's other stuff to think about here. But it's interesting, and it also suggests, that one of the reasons, or it's sort of a head scratcher, why land surface models work as well as they do, and potentially this is one of the reasons for that. Is right that because if plants really are optimizing, then maybe we don't need to know every little tiny detail. The real goal of this work, though, is not just to, do that, but to do what the next step is, which is shining light on these voxels, and trying to understand within each voxel how much carbon is being taken up at a given moment in time, at a given sun angle. And then from there, theoretically, looking at how much carbon is being taken up over time. This process, shining a light on a computer forest, is called three-dimensional radiative transfer modeling. And it's a whole world of super fun math. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because it's still very much in process, but this is work being led by Meicheng Shen, who's a graduate student in my group. And so she's spent the past many years, all of COVID, basically living in this one little synthetic forest and trying to understand how a radiative transfer model works with respect to differences in forest structure. And so this is just one figure from some of her work, just looking at different canopy structures. So here she's using real LiDAR data, but then for the height of the trees, but then instead of using the actual structural data, she's just making pretend shapes of different tree shapes. So one where it's sort of like a lollipop, one where it's sort of like an upside down lollipop, one that's more evenly distributed, and then one that's very apple shaped, we'll say. And then looking at near infrared reflectance and photosynthetically active reflectance or visible reflectance as compared to what we measure with the neon spectrometer. And the point here is basically that these all look relatively similar. And so she spent all this time, and the current conclusion is that, at least in this particular 3D radiative transfer model, there's not a huge difference in what the canopy looks like in relation to how light interacts with it, depending on how you kind of move around the leaves in the canopy. But one thing to know about this particular set of studies or experiments is that this is only really thinking about solar noon. And so because that's what we have as our truth, is looking at reflectance data measured from this airborne spectrometer. And my expectation is that these will start looking a lot different if we start moving that flashlight around the canopy, like the sun moving over the canopy throughout the course of the day. The problem being, we basically never collect satellite data or airborne data outside of solar noon because it causes all sorts of other annoying problems. And so this is the only kind of time period that we have a truth measurement for. But that is where we are currently with that. But the idea here is that, so I said we saw this figure before, but if we look down at this diurnal cycle, this is the part that I'm really interested in. So again, here the red line is the community land model, and the blue line is our air quotes measured values from neon. And what you can see is there's this mismatch, especially during the day. And there's lots of variability, right, on these kind of daily timescales. But throughout the course of the day, the CLM is really not capturing the variation that we see, or not capturing the same patterns that we're seeing in the neon tower measurements. And so our hope is that our model, when we get there, kind of maybe get closer to this blue line, or at least split the difference. And so the sort of conclusions for this part so far are that, it took us a long time to just get to the point of that, like, we could comfortably build these 3D models and believe that they are representing something close to the truth. If you're interested in airborne remote sensing work, I think it's easy to show this stuff and like, oh, it all just works, but it takes a ton of work to get it to actually work at all. And none of it's just works totally out of the box the first time ever, which I guess that's true with everything though. But what's interesting as of now is that, we're still trying to kind of unpack. This is where we're stuck right now, is trying to understand how these structured forests seem to absorb similar amounts of light, even if they have different structures, at least at noon. But we don't know what that's going to look like moving forward. So to go back to the kind of original question of this talk is, do we need to see trees to predict forest processes? I still think yes for semi-arid and savanna systems, depending on the specific process you're trying to understand. But I think there's a good, I'm almost done, it'll be fine. There's a good chance that for temperate forests, maybe we don't need to know everything about every individual tree. So most of what I've talked about, especially the sort of second half of the talk, talking about the airborne stuff and using neon sites, has been really kind of locally focused to sort of relatively small scales, at least, again, for what I do. But what's exciting is that we live in this world now where we're potentially going to be able to do some of these things at much larger spatial scales. And so you might be familiar with G-LiHT, which is a LiDAR system that's on the space station right now, that's allowing us to not exactly globally, but close to globally map forest structure. And then currently under sort of planning stages or post-planning stages is the Surface Biology and Geology mission, which would be a hyperspectral satellite that would potentially launch in, I think, like 2028, maybe now. And it's this guy, because this is not going to last forever, Jedi, but the Surface Biology and Geology mission, along with potential future structure measuring missions, make me hopeful that these stuff that we can right now really only do in the US, where we have the resources to deploy these airborne systems, that we'll be able to start thinking about moving them to other parts of the world where, frankly, the questions I think are more interesting and more pressing than understanding, patterns and processes of Harvard Forest. So I'm super excited about thinking about how these things could scale up into the future. And so, oops, I missed a slide again. There we go. So with that, thank you all for being here. And I just want to acknowledge my lab members. I'm on sabbatical right now, like I said, and I have a whole bunch of new lab members that I don't even have pictures of yet, that I just abandoned, but they're all awesome too, and lots of great colleagues. And I've been fortunate to receive a reasonable amount of funding for all this work. And with that, I am happy to take some questions. And I think, well,
We do have time for questions.
Sure.
For a wonderful talk, what's your best guess for the difference in the seasonal mismatch between the climate model and the neon towers?
Yes. Well, I'll answer.
Yeah.
So it's not a phenology, and so in the community lands model, the way that the phenology model works convert the film by the western video. Rolling the 3 days in the spring, and then and in the fall, it's a little bit complicated. But I mean, it's like reassuring that it works okay in the like the magnitude of the fall, just and even though
Is there, I guess one follow-up question would be, is there, is, like the, you know, how many not land or the ecosystem person at all, but are the, is there, to what extent are the, is a model and the neon tower capturing different things?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and so that so in that particular project, what they've done is they've taken the CLM and they've parameterized it using the
So
they're trying to match as best they can. So it's matching, it's got the same meteorological information that's being collected from the tower. It's got soils information from, they do these mega pits at the neon sites. And so the soils are, you know, representative-ish. Soils are very hard. And then, but there's still only like a single plant functional type because so basically just, you know, or maybe there's 2 in a couple of those runs. So they're trying their best to match it, but you know, again, and I didn't talk a ton about the sort of structure of the community land model or land surface models in general, but generally speaking, you know, they have like one temperate broadleaf deciduous forest or temperate broadleaf deciduous tree plant functional type. And that's meant to cover everything from your, you know, oaks to beeches to birches to everything. And so there is still a lot of heterogeneity within that you know, we know exists. Like I know it from, you know, watching trees in my backyard, like the walnut always drops its leaves before the, you know, mockernut hickory or whatever. And like, that's just not, those subtle differences are not captured in the models. Yeah.
It was really interesting to see the nitrogen, kind of how that goes from being very spatially aligned with species distributions to then being just more random when you account for it as like totally integrated vertically over a given land area. But I'm curious because that's just then converting something from top of canopy to integrated. But the light environment is going to influence how that nitrogen is used for carbon allocation and productivity. Did you take that a step further, or are you thinking about taking that a step further to then look at how, through maybe a voxel-based model, how light environment interacts with the total nitrogen in per unit land area?
Yeah. I mean, that's the goal, is then to put this all together. Once we're like comfortable that the radiative transfer model is like doing what we think it should be doing, then to start, doing exactly that, trying to then estimate how does this actually matter for carbon, instead of right now we're just sort of like making this hand wavy, like, oh, this is interesting. But yeah, that's exactly the goal. Yeah.
Kind of about the lead nitrogen. I was kind of curious, I guess I'm naive about this. Like, what are the components that create the nitrogen? Like, is it DNA? Is it alkaloids? Like, kind of thing.
Yeah. So it's mostly in chlorophyll. And so that's why we see that strong relationship. Different plants are different, and other people in this room know a lot more about this than I do. But it's like broadly, it's the amount of nitrogen in leaves correlates pretty well to the amount of chlorophyll, and therefore the amount of photosynthetic activity that happens. The leaf physiologists want to.
Yeah.
More specifically, yes, ruboscope. Other questions? Yeah.
It's really complicated to create this model. And I'm wondering if you talk more about like how Alomar system can use the LiDAR and perspective data together, and if you can't see through to the understory, how you have to see the nitrogen in there. Yeah, I was just curious about the challenges.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I sort of purposely leave out a lot of the more technical details, but yeah, so the LiDAR, the way the LiDAR system works, right, is it's firing a laser down at the canopy. And one of the things we learned early in this project is that there's like huge amounts of variation in different LiDAR systems, but the LiDAR system that we were working with Neon gives you approximately like 3 to 5 returns per square meter. So for every square meter of ground, you have 3 or 5 points in space that are where the system is bounced off of something. And there's been a decent amount of work taking that information and then from that, turn that into leaf area density measurements, using actually some like very old school ideas about how light transfers through canopies. And so Aaron, the grad student, he spent a ton of time kind of developing that. There's an R package for that now that like allows you to get that leaf area density measurement. And then the top of canopy leaf nitrogen stuff is again a technique that's been around for a while, that we use what's called partial least squares regression to connect top of leaf canopy nitrogen to those hyperspectral data. And so then you have top of canopy nitrogen, and then we just use a statistical relationship between those top of canopy measurements, and then we collected leaves through the canopy so that we could say, okay, at this point, at this GPS location on the ground, we collected these leaves from 15 meters up in the canopy, and this is how much nitrogen was in them, and this is their leaf mass per area. And then we can go to that point in our computer and say, this is the leaf area density estimate we have for that location, and can we model that relationship? And so it works, it would be like all things, it would be great to have, we don't have as much data as we would have liked. It's the sampling method that we use is pretty slow. And so I think if we had more data, we would have more accurate models. This is probably true of everything. But we're reasonably comfortable with kind of those models for some of the systems.
Got time for one last question, I think.
I have one question. So in your fossil-based model, I mean, obviously, like from space, you could really only see the top of the canopy, but I'm wondering if there's any work to maybe somehow include in that model what's happening in the understory as well with the shrubs or forests, because I'm guessing they probably give information to some of the ecosystem processes that we're interested in.
I wish we could see through forest canopies better. I mean, so with the LiDAR we can, and there is space-based LiDAR or spaceborne LiDAR, and there is radar data too. It does get us at the sort of structural heterogeneity of forests, but actually knowing, this is one of the big questions is like if you have a canopy of oaks, but then you have an understory of like another woody shrub, like we just can't see that at all. We could maybe see that it exists there structurally, but not identify like, the leaf nitrogen in those leaves. And so I think, there are like specific cases where you could imagine being able to kind of unpack it using more frequent return data. Like if you have, some sort of phenological difference, or there's like some in the Northeast, there are some evergreen shrubs that grow under deciduous trees. And so then if you had winter data, you could like map those in the winter. And so you'd at least know they were there. But it's just a limitation of the technology, unfortunately. Yeah, but good question. Yeah, because there's the understory does matter too.
It's one thing out of curiosity, based off of your master's student work on the megatransect, where she divided the regions by NTI. Is it similar if you use a different frequency?
That is a good question. We just did NDVI because we like to stick with the basics, but there's been different type of work, but there's the people who think the most about like Landsat time series, I would say, are the like land trender people who do this like kind of attributing changes in land use and disturbance over time, and they do run tests where they do like NDVI and different indexes, like using shortwave infrared, and you do get slightly different results. So yeah, I imagine that it would be pretty different. But what you would actually learn from that, I don't know. Yeah, good question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.